Welcome back to another edition of the Water Matters podcast. I'm pleased to be joined by Tim Smedley. Tim, I haven't seen you for at least a few weeks. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, it's been a while. I mean, I'm now enjoying the sunshine. We might both be looking a little bit tanned. Having had a ridiculously wet start to the year, it's now ridiculously sunny and dry.
It's changed.
So I'm trying to enjoy it. But we'll probably get onto topics during this podcast that will bring that down a little bit.
Quite. No, enjoy the fact that, April has been a lot drier than the first 3 months of the year. We did an episode, listeners may have listened to an episode, I think it came out on, certainly came out on Good Friday earlier this month, and or last month, because this is now coming out on the 1st of May. We did an episode sort of looking back to April 2025, just as a reminder to ourselves as much as anything, but also to anyone that did listen to that episode, just how dry and warm it was back in April 2025. And when we recorded that back in March this year, I was not expecting the same thing to happen at all. It was very wet. It had been doing nothing but rain, essentially. So I sort of chose that topic just because of the stark difference between April last year and what I was expecting April to be this year. And then it hasn't been what I expected at all. It did stop raining and we've had really quite a nice month.
Yeah, it was like someone literally turned the tap off, right? It was so wet in January, February. March was pretty wet too. But April, it's been crazy. We've barely had... So I still keep a rain gauge in my garden. I don't keep it as religiously as I used to.
Yeah.
So this isn't kind of official data, but I don't think we've had more than 10 millimetres in Banbury, in Oxfordshire. And I was hearing from our producer, Jake, that East Anglia has only had 1 millimetre of rainfall in April. I can believe it. So everything is suddenly really dry. There's some fields I walked my dog in that I avoided in January, February because they were so slippy and like a bog, that are now rock solid. It's like walking on concrete. So it is quite strange.
It is, and it's it's a very, very relevant way to start this episode because things can change that quickly, can't they? And you have recently very kindly written a new article for us, which is now live on the watermatters.live website, which is all about the subject of water bankruptcy.
Yeah.
And so you've asked a big question within that article. Have we entered an era of water bankruptcy? Are we already past the point of crisis and into something more permanent? So is water bankruptcy just a provocative phrase, or is it genuinely a new way that we need to think about global water risk? For anyone that's not read the article yet and perhaps is just listening, do you want to give an overview of this topic of global water bankruptcy and where it comes from?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And let me sell it a little bit if that's sounding a dry topic, no pun intended. For anyone watching on YouTube, I'll hold up there. I've got the report in my hand. There's a freshly printed copy. This is a report from the UN called Global Water Bankruptcy, Living Beyond Our Hydrological Means in a Post-Crisis Era. This came out in January this year. So cast our minds back to when we were kind of watching the rainfall every day and cold and grey. I think a lot of people miss this, but I'm calling this the most important climate report that you've never heard of. So it is specifically about water, but it is a climate report, and it's hugely important in its implications. So just to give you kind of the top level of it. So, I mean, I wrote the book, The Last Drop, Solving the World's Water Crisis, very much with the crisis in mind. Interestingly, this report now says that crisis is no longer enough of a framing, that we are beyond that point. Let me just read you a couple of kind of the headlines from it. So the planet, it's saying, has entered the global water bankruptcy era. In many basins and aquifers, long-term water use has exceeded renewable inflows and safe depletion limits. And parts of the water of natural capital, rivers, lakes, aquifers, wetlands, soils, glaciers, have been damaged beyond realistic prospect of full recovery. So crisis, they're saying, is old news. That we are now in parts of the world looking at something different. And they're calling it water bankruptcy. Just skipping onto page 43 when it's distinguishing between stress and bankruptcy. So water stress describes conditions where demand and withdrawals are high relative to available renewable supply. So we're probably looking a bit at minor water stress in the region around us at the moment. We've gone from a wet period to a dry period. We may be looking at, say, some restrictions in summer again of, not using our hose pipes. So hose pipes is a water stress. Hose pipe bans are a water stress response, for example. Then it says water crisis describes acute time-bound episodes where the system is pushed beyond its operating capacity, often by a shock such as drought, flood, contamination, conflict. So again, we can picture that. Water bankruptcy, by contrast, describes a persistent post-crisis state of insolvency and irreversibility of a system in which long-term overshoot and accumulated damage have degraded the system to the point that it can no longer meet demand. An example that comes up in this report, well, a few do. The one that I visited myself when I was writing the book was Lake Mead in Western USA, which has been on a 20-year decline. So at the start of that 20 years, that would have been a water stress problem and was talked about in those terms. So we've got the US's largest reservoir is Lake Mead behind the Hoover Dam. As it started to decline, the first 5 years, that's water stress. Continued to decline into the mid-2010s, early 2020s. You could describe that as a water crisis. So that water is still going down. The water coming out of the Hoover Dam is about half the hydro turbine capacity that it was when it was full. So it used to produce about 2 gigawatts of power. Now it's 1 gigawatt of power. And you can picture that just like a hole in a bucket. If the bucket's full, that water's spurting, and the hole is halfway down, that water is spurting out. As that water goes down, that water coming out starts to be more of a trickle. Now, 2026, the decline continues. The water is no longer at crisis or stress period. It's potentially a bankruptcy situation. Now, I've been telling people since doing book talks from 2 or 3 years ago that at some point Lake Mead's water levels will go down to the point it no longer runs out of the Hoover Dam, no longer go through that hole in the bucket. And that point will be around 10 years' time. That is bankruptcy.
Yeah.
So that's a visible way of understanding this issue. And changing mindsets from stress and crisis to bankruptcy is what this new UN report, it's actually from the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment and Health. That's the main argument in this report. It's saying, what do we do now in areas that go water bankrupt? What will Lake Mead do? That whole area of the Western USA, when their largest reservoir is no longer able to provide water. And they've got so many other examples. So the other example that, is quite shocking is Iran. This is written before the current Iran war. This is completely irrelevant to that in terms of just pure water bankruptcy. So there's images of huge sinkholes that have appeared in Iran's major agricultural regions. Now, sinkholes happen when you're over pumping the groundwater to the extent that the ground above collapses. Again, we see that in Western USA. This isn't in any way unique to Iran. What is unique is perhaps just the scale of it. These are sinkholes that are engulfing whole fields, and there's thousands of them because over-reliance on groundwater as rainfall has become less and less reliable globally, hence why our intro is pretty relevant. Rainfall is less reliable in the UK too. There are some instances of land subsidence, but we are more of a rain-fed agricultural system for now. But in areas that aren't rain-fed, that are completely reliant on irrigation from pumping groundwater, a lot of the world is completely reliant on that, by the way.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to ask. Like, just for clarity, what's it being used for? It's mainly for agricultural and growing crops.
Yes, so the overpumping of groundwater is mainly for agriculture, for sure. It's mainly for growing crops. Again, there's some good stats on this in the report. I will be trying to flick hurriedly back through this report as we talk to find the relevant sections. Another really important thing it points out, though, is that this isn't just a climate crisis issue. So overpumping of groundwater is happening, even if climate change weren't happening. We've been on that trajectory since the 50s. As pumps have got more powerful and drilling ever deeper, we have over-relied on groundwater for irrigation agriculture in many parts of the world. So this is a human-led issue or problem that at some point will come to a head. And in the areas of the world where this is coming to a head, they're calling it water bankruptcy. And they introduced this concept of anthropogenic drought, which was a new phrase to me, but I think sums it up nicely. And it says, anthropogenic drought is central to the world's new water reality. Drought and water shortage are increasingly driven by human activities, over-allocation, groundwater depletion, soil and land degradation, deforestation, etc., rather than natural variability alone. So water bankruptcy is the outcome of long-term anthropogenic drought, not just bad luck with the weather, to paraphrase. So the system we've been following since the 20th century, since these large dams, since groundwater overpumping, which did work for a while, did make a lot of sense, it is now coming to a head. Those dams are, in some places, becoming too old, creaking, losing water, silting up, losing water to evaporation, and the pumping is being over-relied upon to the point that land subsidence, sinkholes, and essentially running out of water is happening. That is what the report is saying is water bankruptcy, and a state that we all now need to learn more about and understand how to deal with it.
Yeah, and the difference, certainly from reading your article, is then really quite obvious, this shift from crisis into bankruptcy. I think it becomes quite clear that the meaning, the key difference is irreversibility. And so we've already lost assets that we cannot recover.
Yeah, and again, groundwater is the best way of being able to get your head around that concept. So again, if you picture overpumping your groundwater, and by overpumping I mean pumping faster than nature can replenish it. So there's no problem with using groundwater if you're using it at the same rate that rainfall is topping it back up again. So we've done that for centuries. That's what wells are. Overpumping is using, large industrial scale pumps to suck those aquifers dry, essentially, to pump them faster than they can top back up again. Again, picture that a bit like drinking milkshake through a straw. The top level, imagine that's land. As you're drinking the milkshake through a straw, that level falls, it goes down. So that's how you cause land subsidence. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's dramatic, and you can see it in these huge sinkholes or huge cracks. But sometimes it's just ploughed over again. If it's in large agricultural regions, it's lots of little cracks that are then ploughed over again. But as that ground level drops a bit year by year by year, you get to many hundreds of meters down. This has happened in the Central Valley in California, for example. The ground level is hundreds of meters down than what it used to be. That's lost aquifer. That's water storage that is never coming back. Yeah. That would have been propped up by a large porous aquifer full of water. As that aquifer is overpumped, the ground level crushes it, and you lose that forever. So again, that's what a bankrupt system would be. If that continues, at some point that aquifer goes. You lose it. So Central Valley, California is a famous example. Another example I often talk about is the Ica Valley in Peru, which didn't used to be a big farming region, but it had a big agribusiness boom when it was discovered that it had a large fossil aquifer underneath it. So the Ica Valley in Peru gets even less rainfall than East Anglia. It gets about 7 millimeters per year. That's not going to ever top up any aquifer. There's no natural replenishment of that aquifer. The aquifer is from a previous geological era when the water was laid down there, a bit like an oil bed. So as you pump that water, it's never coming back. You keep pumping it until it goes dry. So it's fueled an agribusiness boom. So Ica Valley, Peru, if you look at out of season asparagus in the supermarket, quite often we'll say from Peru. Green beans, quite often say from Peru. Some grapes. So a lot of these regions we are relying on for our out-of-season fruit and vegetables are able to produce that through overpumping. And overpumping will lead and is leading in some regions to water bankruptcy.
Yeah.
And that is why this report is so important and why I'm so glad to be speaking about it on a podcast, because I don't think anyone has spoken about this report outside of really niche water circles, and I think it's important for people to know about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I suppose just to stress that point, is there anything else that obviously you mentioned a few places specifically. We've covered a few industries there a little bit, but if this was a financial analogy, who is insolvent today? Countries, regions, industries. Is there anywhere else or anything else that you would add?
Well, so Iran is now talking about moving Tehran, the capital city. That in itself is a crazy sentence, right? Tehran is a huge city of about 10 million people, but they believe they can't sustainably provide water to that region anymore, to the city of Tehran. And again, this is all, these conversations were happening last year. This is all prior to the current catastrophe of the US-Israel war. So that's quite a shocking thing to contemplate. Yeah. But one thing the report does quite well is it shows some satellite aerial footage of a few disappearing lakes. One of them is the third largest lake in the world, the Aral Sea, and that's on the border between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And now it's called the Aral Sea because if anyone has visited the Great Lakes in the US, for example, you can't see the other side of them. These are freshwater equivalents of seas. These are huge, huge lakes. The Aral Sea is bigger than some of the US Great Lakes. It's pretty much disappeared. I'm going to lean over and show that to you, Matt. Sorry, listeners. The top shows the Aral Sea when it was full a few years ago. Now it's just a few slivers left. And that's crazy. For an inland sea, that shouldn't be able to happen.
What page is that on within the report? We'll put the link to the report in the notes on the on this podcast episode.
Yeah, that's page 26. An amazing view of essentially an inland sea, the world's third largest lake, disappearing in what's the first photo is 1989, second photo is 2025. This is largely due to human overuse of the water in that area. There's many countries on the brink of this situation. What the UNU are trying to do is get ahead of that and say, listen, you're going in that direction. You've got to start doing something about this now. We've had so many kind of wake-up calls. I do feel, though, I'm probably being a bit pessimistic, but I think as important as I think this report is, I think lots of people won't pick it up until they reach that situation and go, oh no, how do we get out of this? Oh, look, the UN wrote about this in January 2026.
Yeah.
So when they start getting to solutions, they do start talking perhaps a bit too much for my liking about the next UN water meeting in 2028 or whatever. I think we're way beyond that, and the messaging in the report, it's also way beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just hard for them to know what else to say, being the UN. That okay, well we can solve it in another COP, but I mean I've become fairly cynical about COPs because I don't see enough change coming. So yeah,
and it's change that has to come. I think your article makes quite clear. It has to come from the human sort of behavioural change. Because regardless of climate change, unless we change the way water is extracted and used, it's not going to improve regardless, is it? I think that's what you're saying.
Yeah, basically. And sorry if there's sounds of me flicking through the pages. There was a particular part of the report I just wanted to read out that does get to the heart of the matter of how to solve it. Yeah, there's a great passage on page 52, which I think really gets to the heart of the solutions matter. And it says, agricultural transitions should actively rebuild the natural systems that store and regulate water. On-farm and landscape scale practices that improve soil structure and organic matter, such as conservation tillage, cover crops, agroforestry, controlled grazing, can increase infiltration, reduce runoff, and enhance soil moisture storage, making rain-fed and supplemental irrigation systems more resilient. And then it says at basin scale, which kind of basically means around rivers and wetlands and lakes, nature-based solutions, including the protection and restoration of wetlands, floodplains, reforestation, and critical recharge zones, aquifer recharge schemes, essentially the way to go. In water bankrupt systems, these measures can stabilise remaining water and natural capital.
Right.
So these are solutions that we've talked about on this podcast before. They're known, really. It's about saying, okay, we've gone too far down one particular route. We now have to work with nature and restore nature because that's where our water comes from.
Yeah.
So the solutions are known. Again, it's about just waking up to those issues before it's too late. And yeah, depending on my mood on the day, I'm optimistic or pessimistic about whether, communities, governments, nations are capable of that before the crisis goes too far.
Yeah, and awareness of the issue in the first place is therefore a really critical aspect of it, isn't it? Because, as you said, I wasn't aware of this document, and I'm sure plenty of people aren't, and it's much less likely that people will do anything about it if they're not aware of it in the first place. And so, obviously, one of the main reasons, as we said on the earlier initial episodes of this podcast, one of our aims was to increase the awareness and conversation around water and sort of the educate people on what is happening and what's really important.
Yeah, and it does link to what can be done about it.
Yes.
What can be done about it is largely positive. It's largely about the restoration and conservation of our natural systems. And we've covered that a lot on this podcast.
Yes,
and we've seen some really positive examples, such as the beaver reintroductions in England, that are doing just that are turning water crisis areas where wetlands have been destroyed or ploughed over, or floodplains are being ploughed over, and turning them back into more natural systems where the rivers can spread out onto floodplains and recharge aquifers. That's how you turn things around. Mm-hmm. So there are still lots of positive stories out there that show us the way to go, that show us that solutions are there if we really want to listen and change the practices that have gone too far the other way and are leading to this bankruptcy.
Sure, exactly. But I think a big part of that is helping people to realize why it matters to everyone, because I think it would be easy, even listening to some of the examples there, someone sat at home in the UK listening to this podcast, seeing these pictures of parts of America or parts of Iran or, other places around the world. If bankruptcy hits one region, how quickly does it ripple into global food markets, for example?
Well, that's exactly the point. So, people listening are unlikely to care that much about the RLC. We don't have any direct connection to it. But yes, as you can picture almost a domino effect as a region goes water bankrupt, especially if it's a large agricultural system, such as central Iran, such as Ica Valley, Peru. Agribusiness then needs to move on to another area to overpump and exploit. So there's a ripple effect of areas currently not in water bankruptcy will still be affected because they will then have to, will still be impacted, because they will then have to produce more in order to keep up with current levels of consumption. The main thing we'll start to see in this country is effect on food prices, for sure. So as systems go water bankrupt that produce, California, just to pick an example, produces 90% of the world's almonds. You'll suddenly see a spike in almond prices. Almonds are in a lot of things. It's not just a packet of almonds. This is most cakes, most pastries. Almonds are used a lot. Figs, grapes, wine. Prices spike in one region, that impacts us here. And also just shopping habits too, starting to look at where our food comes from, what's in season, what's out of season. So we will increasingly see an impact from this as regions go water bankrupt in this country. We are not at risk of water bankruptcy yet. Some areas, in the south and east, potentially in a few years' time, we could be talking about these issues too.
And so initially, who needs to act differently first?
Well, the message from the report, I think, is more directed at areas right now at risk of water bankruptcy.
Yeah.
There it is a turning around of practices. So there's in my blog, I finish on Turkey again. And there's an interesting example of Dr. Ese Unar, who's started a cooperative that trains growers across the country to return to traditional farming methods that don't use groundwater pumping. So again, that kind of sounds a bit wishy-washy, but that's been the majority of human existence before we survived without industrial scale water pumping. So these methods have been around for many, many centuries. Returning to them isn't any kind of admission of defeat. It's quite the opposite. It's an admission of how do you farm in a truly sustainable manner. And so her practices, the ones she's trying to reintroduce, use no groundwater pumping, prepare the soil, encourage plants to grow deeper roots. And she's quoted in The Guardian saying, "Soil is a living organism. The only way to solve the crisis is to stop trying to make nature do things our way. We have to imitate her ways." And I thought that really neatly sums it up.
Yeah.
It's kind of about remembering that we are part of the natural system. We're animals living within a natural system.
Yeah.
We try through engineering and mechanical means to disconnect us from that. And for a time it kind of worked, but now we're realizing it doesn't work in the long term. It's unsustainable. It leads to water bankruptcy. But there are ways around it. Relearning nature-based solutions and old methods of farming is one approach.
Mm. But I think you've explained it very well in your article. But the chosen word, the how they're describing this, specifically using the word bankruptcy, is very clever in a way, isn't it? Because most people that will be familiar with that word would probably know it from a business or personal sort of perspective, wouldn't they? And bankruptcy does tend to mean the end of something, but that naturally then allows for the beginning of something else, and I think so. Yeah, the definition of what it meant when it was a crisis situation and now a bankruptcy situation does help, certainly. The way, my thinking when I was reading your article, it does actually help you understand, okay, that's the big shift. It does, it's bankrupt, it's gone, it's, we're now going to move on in a different direction, doing different things, and changing things accordingly.
Yeah, definitely. And that realization is coming, it's hitting in certain areas that are pumping the aquifers to extinction. That is happening, and it may well come to parts of Europe and the UK too, if that same system is followed. I still feel there's plenty of time to turn it around, however.
Yeah, so there is the possibility of there's the risk of it in the UK, if potentially, I suppose, if that's what you're saying, but we're probably still in the stress phase.
Yeah, I think we're still in the stress and crisis phase in the UK, but I wouldn't take that as... Yeah, I wouldn't take that lightly. Don't get too comfortable. Yeah. Because we are lucky to have slightly more rainfall than some areas of the world, but we don't have that much rainfall. Again, going back to some of our earlier podcasts.
And would you say we're most exposed on the supply, the infrastructure, or demand? Like, where's the biggest exposure
for the UK?
Yeah,
I guess supply. Mm-hmm. I think that's coming. I think food prices are already seeing going up due to climate impacts. In the UK, farming is getting much harder because of these extreme lurches between flood and drought. Again, seeing it again this year. Incredibly wet and rainy first 2 months, now incredibly dry again. It's very hard for farmers to know how to deal with that. So as our own farming supply gets harder, we will lean more on international supply, but some of this international supply are in these regions, so they are moving towards water bankruptcy. So we're very overexposed in both directions.
And if you had one message for policymakers, what would it be?
Always nature-based solutions. That really is the crux of the matter. I really do think that's the front line of the water crisis, is helping to reconnect our natural water system. We disconnected it from the Victorian era onwards. We ploughed up and dried up our floodplains, which disconnects the rivers from the aquifers. The only way to reconnect those is nature-based solutions. It's helping to top up our water supply. Again, there's this financial link. We can look at aquifers almost as our bank account, and infiltration into those as our payments to that bank account. We cut off those payments long ago. We're starting to see the impact of that. We're starting to realise the impact of that. That is now made harder by climate change because of this lurching between flood and drought times, but it isn't actually caused by climate change. The cause, as the report makes clear, is anthropogenic. It's a human engineering choice that was made in the 20th century, but we're now realising that doesn't work. So what the one message would be: look at nature-based solutions, look at paying into those natural bank accounts, our aquifers, but also our rivers and natural lakes. But there's also perhaps an over-reliance politically and in public thinking that, well, we just need to build more reservoirs. We need more concrete bowls full of water. There is some truth to that. We do also need more reservoirs, but it's the big message that I always try and get across is, but what's filling up those reservoirs? You need that money coming in.
Yeah.
So again, a reservoir is akin to a savings account, a small one. It's never going to be anything like the size of a natural aquifer. Yeah. So it's a small little pot, and we're overly focused on building more small pots. We do need some piggy banks, maybe is a better analogy. Yeah. We're overly focused on adding a few more piggy banks around the country. They are useful, they are good. We do need more, but it's what's filling up those piggy banks is our natural system. So restoring, working with our natural system is almost the entire story of this issue, and I think comes across quite well in the United Nations report when they get to that section. Yeah. It then goes on to, well, we'll discuss this and they name all these different meetings coming up. I don't know how useful these high-level meetings are, but equally, it's a really good report. So hopefully, it's got the right people talking, the right policymakers talking.
And from the report itself, and obviously your sort of what you've read from it and your interpretation of it, are we still in time to avoid water bankruptcy becoming like a global norm, or has it already happened?
Yeah, well, this is where it almost gets onto a philosophical question, right, or at the very least a futurist one, and it's really hard to know the answer to it. I do feel we're living in a time that won't be repeated of very cheap, out of season food, fruit and vegetables. I don't think in 30 years' time it will be the same system, because I think a lot of the regions that are growing those fruit and vegetables will have gone water bankrupt, will no longer have the water to keep producing to that extent. I don't think we'll suddenly have huge food shortages, but I think we'll probably start to relearn our seasons again in terms of asparagus shouldn't be on my table in December, some things like that I think are inevitable.
Yeah.
Because of these regions going water bankrupt.
Yes. Yeah.
But maybe there's an element of that not being a bad thing. I don't know. I certainly don't want to see food go more expensive. There's a lot of vulnerable people that would hurt hardest. So that, I think, is really the reason why we need to get ahead of this topic.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of issues that the politicians need to get ahead of in terms of how do we make food supply fair and equitable as the food prices increase. Yeah. Because again, I do think that's inevitable. So hence why it's so important to be talking about this.
Absolutely. Well, we've done exactly that, and hopefully listeners interested in this topic. And if you want to learn more, like I say, we'll put a link to that report in the notes and the description of this episode. And Tim, as I said, has written an article about this very subject, which is on watermatters.life, which I would encourage you to go read. And then we have the ability at the bottom of those articles now for you to add comments. If you've subscribed to the watermatters.life fortnightly newsletter, then you'll be able to log in with your email address and share your comments with us. Tell us what you think. What's your perspective on this, and what do you think that needs to happen next? This Water Matters podcast and newsletter is all about bringing these conversations to the surface, sharing more about what's going on in the world of water management and all the things that highlight why water matters. And so another good episode. Thank you very much, Tim. Appreciate you joining me and sharing this, bring this to our attention. If you've liked this episode, please remember to like and subscribe and tell everyone you know about it. We need more people talking about these water matters. But thanks for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks' time with the next episode of the Water Matters podcast.